what's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel, Lone Wolf 902. In today's video, this is going to be part 3 of my 3-part series, how to get started in hot tenting. This particular part is probably the most important part of the series. This is all going to be on safety. So here I have a very specific stove and tent choice. I have the One Tigris Smoky Hut tent, and inside I have the Pomoly T1 stove with a 2-meter pipe attached and a spark arrestor up top. So we're going to be breaking down this setup, going around the tent and the stove, talking about very specific things that can cause any type of danger or damage to yourself or your gear, and basically going over all of the safety tips that I would like to talk to and mention to new users, new hot tent users, and experienced hot tent users as well. Okay, so starting things off, I want to come outside of the tent to talk about something very important that a lot of people tend to overlook, is the guy out points. Okay, so starting down at the bottom, I have my stakes into the ground very, very securely. The tent is pulled out nice and tight. That will sag over the course of your stay if you're doing 3 or 4 nights, because the fabric is known to sag once it gets wet. So you do need to kind of stretch it out and make sure your tent choice is tight. Whatever you're using, make sure it's tight at all times. So it does take a little bit of time to go out, readjust things, but take the time to do so. Now, for video purposes, I did not attach the guy out lines because I'm going to be walking around the tent, but I will mention, any tent that you're using, use your guy out lines, okay? So guy out from here, giving that tent a lot of body and a lot of structure to hold up in the wind, in the snow, whatever conditions you have. Make sure your tent is guyed out and make sure it's securely put into the ground as well. One other thing I would like to mention when setting up your tent, this particular tent has a loop up top where you can actually eliminate the center pole and set the tent up using this loop up here. I will highly suggest that you never ever use a tent that has these loops up top while you are burning a stove inside of the tent. Use the center pole. The center pole is there to give structure to the tent from inside, holding the tent up. If you support your tent by this externally, if something were to happen overnight, if this stitching were to let go, or if your cordage were to let go, anything in the world can happen, and the possibilities are there. This will completely collapse. Your tent will collapse on top of you, landing on your stove and on top of you, melting, lighting on fire. I have seen this happen. It has not happened to me, but I have seen this happen before. One of these have actually let go and the whole tent came crashing down on top of the stove, and it ended up burning a gigantic hole in the side of the tent. So keep in mind, these manufacturers make these tents to be used not just in wintertime, okay? So you can use this loop and close off the stove jack opening and use this as a non-hot tent in spring, in summer, throughout the year. So just keep that in mind. Don't use these loops while you have a stove burning inside of the tent. All right, so moving inside of the tent, like I said, I specifically chose this stove for this video. This is the T1 stove from Pomoly. This is the regular size, not the mini. This is a large stove for a small tent, and the reason why I chose it is because I want to express my kind of general rule of use of 12-inch space. So I have 12-inch space in the front, both sides, the back, the top. I have 12-inch space all the way around the stove, except for underneath of the stove. Now I use this rule, 12-inch clearance, because these stoves will get very, very hot, even if you're using a small stove. The small version of the stove, I'll mention that right now. The small version of the T1 and the Timberwolf stove, and even a 50 caliber ammo can stove, being very small, will get this tent ridiculously hot. It will also heat a 6-person tent very, very hot. So it's kind of a misconception of people that are getting started in hot tenting. You think that you need this gigantic stove to heat a tent. That's completely false. This is literally fire in a box in a tent. These tents get extremely hot. I've had this particular tent with an ammo can stove 45 degrees Celsius by hanging a thermometer at the top of the tent. So these get extremely hot, okay? Now, my rule of 12 inches all the way around applies to not only the stove, also the pipe, okay? I have a rule of 24 inches that I will use for the pipe above the peak of the tent, okay? We'll talk about that in a little bit more, but talking about the 12-inch rule, you're not going to get 12 inches underneath of the stove because the legs are only short. So in wet conditions in winter, if the ground's frozen or you're in snow, it's not really going to be an issue. But if you're in fall and you've got a lot of dry leaves or maybe dry grass underneath of your stove, generally there's not a whole lot of heat that goes down enough to catch the ground on fire. But to prevent that, I often take rocks and I'll slide them underneath of the stove. This does two things. It not only soaks in the heat and radiates the heat when the stove dies down throughout the night, but it also creates the ground from getting too hot if you do have grass and stuff that is touching the bottom of the stove. You can use a mat on the bottom or a piece of titanium or whatever you want, but the best method to do is just take rocks, place them underneath. Doesn't matter if they're wet or dry. I'll mention this because it's not getting that hot underneath. The rock is not going to explode. I've used wet rocks. I've used river rocks right out of the river, put them underneath my stove to test this. It does not get that hot. So 12-inch space all the way around your stove. Make sure you've got that. And 24 inches above the top of your tent from your pipe. Make sure you've got 24 inches up top clearance. So coming outside of the tent, like I was just saying, you have to have that 24-inch gap from the tip of your tent to the top of the pipe. Now this is my general rule, because if you are burning different woods, if you're burning softwood or if you're stirring the inside of the stove, which I highly recommend you never do, those embers will come out of the top, and this 24-inch gap gives enough time for those embers to A, burn out, or B, blow away from the tent and stop from burning holes in your tent. It's also a good length because you don't want to go too much higher than that, because the wind will start affecting the pipe, because the stove jack is down here. So you really don't want the pipe going too far out of the stove jack, because that jack will supply some degree of holding that pipe together. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in just a second, but having a spark arrestor up top like I do now, I also have these guy lines to stop that pipe from moving. You'll also notice that these guy lines, I can move these guy lines without the pipe moving. That is exactly what you want. You never want your guy line tight like this so it's pulling on the pipe. These guy lines are only here to prevent major movements in the wind, and I've been seeing a lot of this on social media of people guying these out really tight, holding it down, or adding little sections of shock cord so it can move around. That it's not really a good safety practice to do it that way. The best method is to just have them nice and loose like this, secured to the ground. If the wind blows hard enough, it will tighten it up and it'll bring it back to where it needs to go. The problem with guying these out very tight is you have to remember that that pipe is very, very hot. When metal gets hot, it gets soft and it bends. So if you have these anchored down really, really tight, when you get that stove hot, it's going to get softer. Remember, this pipe is only like 0.4 of a millimeter in thickness of the material. It's very, very thin. So even though it's titanium, it's very strong. If you add pressure to this and you got it pulled down, when that gets hot and then the wind comes in and blows it, it will most likely bend the pipe and it will create a failure point in the pipe, and you'll end up having it fold over, which is extremely dangerous because it'll melt the outside of your tent. Not only that, it will smother the stove and the smoke will not be able to get out, so it'll basically roll inside of the tent, hopefully not while you're sleeping. So just a general rule, have these nice and loose enough to just kind of correct the pipe in the movement of the wind, and not tight enough that it's going to really create a failure point when the stove gets hot enough to get that pipe red hot and bending back and forth. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take the stove out of the tent. I've already got the pipe off, but I just want to mention really quick that these Pomoly stoves and a lot of other stoves on the market, on the legs, they actually have holes drilled into them. So you can see those two little holes. Those are for tent pegs. So you can take an actual peg and stake the stove down to the ground. So here I'm on grass. I could put pegs through the legs in the front and the rear and hold that stove secure. So if you're in your tent and you accidentally happen to bump it, it's not going to create any failure points. It's not going to roll. It's very, very, very difficult to get these to move while you're in the tent, but just as an added precaution, there are holes down here to stake your stove to the ground and make it more secure. So now that I've got the stove down and the pipe out of the tent, here's the spark arrestor. And I'm gonna pop in a close-up of the spark arrestor because this is very, very important. I've been burning in this particular spark arrestor for 3 days non-stop. I've had this stove, a longer pipe with this exact spark arrestor for 3 days solid, burning nothing but hardwood. And like I said, I'll pop in a close-up image of just how much creosote is in this, because there's next to nothing in this. So I have 3 guy lines that I've attached to rings on the spark arrestor. It's very important that you never attach your lines, if they're not metal, directly to the arrestor, because it will get hot and it'll melt these lines off. So I put on key rings. They're just metal loops that I've attached there, and then I attach my guy line directly to that, and that creates a safe barrier for heat so these don't melt. Also, with these spark arrestors, move these lines out of the way. These holes are large enough that it will basically break up any large sparks. Now, talking about how I was burning this for the last 3 days, I only burn hardwood in here. You can burn softwood, but generally you want to burn hardwoods in your stove to create a much cleaner burn. Softwoods will put off a lot of sparks, a lot of embers, and a lot of unwanted creosote that you really don't want to have to deal with inside of your stove. Also, what these do is stop any rain or any debris from going down into the pipe when the stove's not burning and you're away from camp. So if you're out on a really heavy rainy day and you're out of camp and the stove's not burning, because typically when it's burning, any water that goes down into the pipe quickly becomes evaporated from the heat of the stove. But if the stove's not burning at that particular point in time, you're away from camp, this will stop anything from going down into the pipe. Now, the reason why I'm talking about the spark arrestor so closely is because I've noticed a lot of people online and on social media trying to modify these, okay? It's very dangerous when you modify a spark arrestor. These holes, as I mentioned, are designed to break up the larger embers. If you have a lot of embers coming out of your stove, you are not burning that stove correctly, and it is very dangerous. So like I said, burn hardwoods. If you are burning softwoods, try and burn them on a lower rate. So damp your stove down, use your rear damper to damp it down, and it'll still get hot inside of the tent. Do not stir the coals in your stove either. I see a lot of people doing this. They'll open the door, they'll fiddle and faddle around. It's just spitting sparks out the top of your pipe and they're landing on the tent, okay? So the spark arrestor, the holes that are on here, like I said, they're designed to break up a lot of the smaller sparks. They're also large enough that it's not going to collect any buildup of carbon or creosote, okay? When you apply a small mesh to these, they become extremely dangerous and they will clog up very quickly. Hardwood or softwood, they will clog up quickly. And I know from firsthand experience, because I've done this in the past, I've woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning and my entire tent was completely covered in smoke, okay? Because it clogged up outside and the smoke came inside of the tent. Now luckily I woke up, I was laying on the ground, so I wasn't really in the smoke. The smoke was kind of rising, but it is extremely dangerous. So do not modify these. If you're having a problem with buildup of carbon in your spark arrestor or in your pipe, it's because you're not burning it correctly. So take some time and learn how to burn your stove correctly. It does take time. Every stove is different. And I will mention materials are very different as well. Titanium cools very quickly. So you'll notice that down here, get these guy lines out of the way. Down here, this is the pipe, the part of the pipe that attaches to the stove. You'll notice it's nice and purple and blue, but then you'll notice that it quickly fades back to regular titanium, okay? So this is where the heat is at. And this is one of the great properties of titanium, is it cools very quickly. So all that heat is right here into this section, and then it starts to fade in this section. And it goes back to regular titanium color, okay? So what this means is, by the time it gets up to the top, I mean, it's not cold where you can come and touch it. Don't touch it because you will burn yourself. But it's not like stainless steel where the entire length of the pipe is going to hold that heat. And that's very important, because when you have a pipe that is very hot all the way up, it allows that creosote and carbon to stay liquid and actually run back down into the stove. Not a problem with titanium generally, but if you have a sectional pipe, often that creosote will run outside of the pipe and all the way down. With titanium, it cools very quickly. The heat comes up and it cools, and what happens is it makes that carbon and creosote turn into crystals. Those crystals then land on the side of the pipe and then they get burned off, which means you have a completely clean pipe the entire stay of your trip, including the spark arrestor. It gets very hot, it burns off the carbon. Now this guy is way up at the top, so it's not getting pounded with all that heat like it would in a steel pipe. This is cooling very quickly. So these do cool off. They don't need mesh, is basically what I'm trying to say. You don't want to add mesh to this. It'll create more problems down the road. It'll make it even more dangerous. And I know a lot of the people that are applying mesh to this, they're new to hot tenting. And when we're new to things, we want to tinker with things and we want to kind of see if we can modify it to make it better, improve the performance of it. It's already improved, okay? If you're having a problem with your spark arrestor, it's not the arrestor, it's how you're burning your stove. So you need to put some time into learning how to burn that better. All right, so getting back on topic here, I could talk about pipes and stoves all day long, but I want to keep this simple and fun and educational at the same time. So we're going to move on to the stove jack. Here you'll notice my stove jack has a flap on top. This is a DIY stove jack that was made. I didn't purchase this one. I'm gonna take it out of the tent. A little bit easier to show. So first off, you'll notice that the tent material is rolled up and it is very secure. What this flap does is it opens up, covering that flap of the tent. Even more protection from the pipe. Now this isn't going anywhere because it's secure, but this little flap has more than just that use. So picture the pipe coming out of here. Have the pipe right here. So we've got the pipe coming out of the tent essentially. This flap here is going to stop any rain or snow from running down into the stove jack. The reason why I'm mentioning this is I see a lot of people that are insulating this gap around the pipe to the stove jack. Now this particular stove jack fits quite snug. Most of the time you'll find that tent manufacturers will actually introduce a 2-inch gap from the size of the pipe to the walls of the stove jack. Some stove jacks even have little pie cut slices with little fingers that the pipe pushes upwards. What I'm trying to say is you do not ever want to insulate your pipe to fill in the gap around your stove jack. When you do this, you're essentially creating, one, no airflow. That is important to have airflow to come in and out to have the stove function properly. Also, it helps mediate the temperature. You're not going to get a whole ton of rain running down inside of your tent. Most of the time you're going to be dealing with snow, so it's not an issue. If you are having an issue with that, pick up stove jack with a flap or go with the stove jack with the little fingers like I was telling you about. You put your stove pipe through the bottom, those fingers open up like a flower, and that helps redirect snow and rain around the hole instead of it going down in there. Now, when you insulate the gap, so I'm going to pull this pipe out. When you insulate the gap from the pipe to the walls of the stove jack, remember, this material is fireproof. It's not going to burn. You can literally hold a lighter underneath this fabric and it will not burn. When you insulate the gap, what you're doing is you're actually creating a bridge of heat transfer. So the heat will go into that insulation that you've now applied, and it will go into the stove jack, and it will go into the Velcro and into the tent, creating a failure point. So it's really important to have your pipe not actually touching the sidewalls of your stove jack. Now, like I mentioned, if you do have a jack with those little fingers that open up the little triangle slices, those little fingers still have an air gap that introduces cool air and warm air to both go in and out. It doesn't work the same as locking it down, putting insulation around your pipe to lock in that hole. Because keep in mind, these tents need oxygen. You really do need air to come in and out of the tent to keep it safe. And these stoves will heat a tent. It's not going to matter if you have a 2-inch gap up here, trust me. The stove is going to get the tent ridiculously hot. That's why it's called hot tenting. The tent will be hot. You do not want to create an airtight capsule where you have a stove inside, because it'll be very dangerous. So don't insulate this gap if you do have a pipe. This is a 2.5-inch diameter pipe. The Pomali tents that this pipe is from, this is from Pomali. The Pomali tents have about a 5-inch hole. You don't want to insulate that. That hole is there to not only accommodate larger pipes, but it's also there to introduce that airflow and have that safe gap so that pipe can both let air in and out. Now I will mention on the Pomali tents, I don't have one here because I wanted to keep this simple. They do have a yellow rope fabric around that stove jack area. So the stove jack material is actually green on those tents. The yellow rope, you can actually push from the inside of the tent, push it up. So it creates a little bit of a lip. The rainwater will hit that lip and it'll go around, so it won't run inside. Okay, so that's another little hack. But what I want to make out of this little talk is don't insulate the hole. okay? Let that pipe sit freely in that hole and allow the air to come in and out. Don't insulate it so that this is touching the jack. It's just not safe. Okay, so now that I've got the stove out of the tent and I've got the pipe down, the stove jack out, I want to talk about the tent setup because this is quite universal for any hot tent. Now, I chose this tent on purpose because it doesn't have any snow skirts. You'll notice the entire bottom of the tent is wide open. This is very important for air control. I often see a lot of people will completely just barricade the whole tent, the whole outside with snow, so there's no oxygen coming in. This goes to carbon monoxide myth of hot tenting. I say myth because it is so unlikely. It is very, very, very unlikely to have any kind of oxygen problem in your tent when using it properly, okay? I've had O2 monitors in my tent. I've actually battened it down completely, like I just said, completely closed it in. That monitor will not go off, okay? There is just so much air coming into these tents through the top vents. We have vents up here, fresh air. We've got that gap of our stove jack to the pipe, like I said. You got a nice little air gap there. But the fabric's not airtight. The fabric is not, it's waterproof. It's treated for water, but it's not airtight, okay? So keep in mind your stove is a vacuum. It's sucking in oxygen to breathe, to burn. So it's gonna be pulling in oxygen into the tent, okay? So if your fire goes out and it's smothered, there's not enough oxygen. So having that glass window on your stove is very important to have. When looking in, you can see the health of your fire. It also prevents you from opening the door often and fiddling around with it, creating sparks which are spitting out the top and all that nonsense. So the big myth of having a stove in the tent and having carbon monoxide poisoning or any other kind of issues, it's really, really unlikely, okay? When I run a tent with snow skirts on the outside, often if I'm sleeping on this side, I will cover the back side with snow and I'll leave the rest of the tent completely open, okay? You do not need to close up your tent and try and make it this fortress to hold in all that heat, because believe me, take it from me, I've been doing this for years. The stove inside of your tent is going to make the tent extremely hot, okay? It's called hot tenting. It is going to be hot. You do not need your tent completely battened down. The only reason why you would need snow skirts is to prevent that wind from coming in, okay? So I know it's a huge concern of people getting into hot tenting. It's also the first mistake a lot of people make, is they'll just completely try and make their tent airtight by closing off the whole bottom, zipping the door shut, closing in the gap around the pipe, and making all those newbie mistakes. You don't want to do that. Your stove will get the tent hot, trust me. So on the topic of your tent getting very, very hot, that is another concern with the center pole, okay? This center pole on this tent is aluminum. Doesn't matter the material, whether it's aluminum or steel. At the top of your tent, it is going to get incredibly hot, okay? This is good so you can hang clothing from the top. If you got a wet hat, a wet sweater, you can hang it. As long as it's not near your stove, it will dry out. Be very, very cautious, because often some people will grab a hold of the pole while they're getting up off the ground. They get very hot, okay? It gets very, very, very hot at the top of these tents. So be very, very cautious. If you do have your door unzipped like this particular zipper, the pulls are actually string, but if you do have a zipper that has a metal tab, be careful grabbing that, because these will get extremely hot and so will the pole. So just be mindful of that when coming in and out of the tent if you are kind of using this as a little bit of a stand, because they are quite secure and you can pick yourself up using that. I don't recommend it, but if you ever do touch it, or if you do have something metal that's hanging from the top, so if you do have like a metal thermometer or a flashlight, be very careful touching that, because it will get extremely hot up there and it will burn your hand. All right, so to wrap this video up on safety, the sun's coming out for one, so it is looking like a nice sunny day. I do want to mention that there are a lot more safety aspects that I did not touch on, and I could go on and on and on and on and on about safety in hot tents, and it never ends, okay? One thing I do want to mention is the manufacturers put the time and research into their product to make it work. So you don't need to modify your spark arrestor with mesh. You don't need to modify the tent. You don't need to modify your stove jack and clogging that opening. You don't need to do that. The products exist the way they exist because of unknown reasons. You might not know why why the holes on this are so big. You might not know that because you might not have the experience of hot tenting. And like I said, this is how to get started in hot tenting. That's what the series is. So I will basically say use the gear that you get as it is intended to be used for. You don't want to go tinkering and modifying things. It can be very dangerous. All right, so I think I covered what I wanted to cover, a lot of the major parts, because hot tenting is becoming extremely popular with people getting into it, and with that is good and bad. There's a lot of sharing of information, and then there's a lot of people that I call them couch sitters, basically people that are sitting on their couch at home watching what other people do or reading or coming up with these crazy ideas. Put mesh in there, clog it up. They're sitting on their couch and they're just talking, okay? Hot tenting is something that is very, very dangerous, and you should be taking the information from people that actually have the experience in doing it. Not just once, not just twice, but doing it over years. I've been doing this for many years. I've used homemade products, I've used commercial made products. I am no professional, okay? I've made mistakes and I've learned from them. I'm picking on that number one mistake with clogging the spark arrestor with mesh, because that is something that I've done years ago, and I've learned you don't need to do that. If you're having issues with this clogging up, it's not happening here, it's happening in the stove. You need to burn that correctly, okay? So a lot of knowledge, a lot of information in this video. I could have covered more, but it just would have been non-ending. So if you do have any questions about any other issues, some that I covered, some that I may not have covered, drop it down in the comment section. And I know this video was kind of a different approach. I wanted to kind of approach this in a more serious manner, and it is something serious. It is very, very serious. When you do get into hot tenting, it can be very rewarding. It's very, very enjoyable, but it can also be very dangerous if you do it improperly, okay? So use the equipment the way it's supposed to be used, and do your research. Do your research, learn from people that have been doing it, not from people that are just talking about doing it, okay? That's another very, very important point that I want to make. Find a good source of knowledge. Whoever, wherever you find it, whatever choice you make, find a good source of good knowledge of the equipment, good knowledge of the activity, and learn from it. But most importantly, try it and learn for yourself, and stay safe and have fun. Peace out, guys.